I don't think we can overestimate just how much the Comstock laws would shape that post-Civil War Reconstruction, like early 20th century era in terms of the distribution of birth control information, abortion information and provision, and then obviously prostitution and pornography as well.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Lauren Thompson. Thank you so much for being here, Lauren.
You excited to be here?
We're going to be talking about the subject of her future book, her forthcoming book, which is birth control in the 19th century. For our purposes, it'll focus around the Civil War years, but our conversation will be wide ranging and we'll probably touch in all facets of the 19th century. And the title of said forthcoming book is The Battle for Birth Control, Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, and the Rivalry That Shaped a Movement, due out likely sometime in 2023. So get excited for that. If you're avid followers of us here at the museum, Lauren might be familiar to you as someone that has written one of the most popular articles to ever go up on our blog on the same subject. So if you haven't read that, be sure and check that out. We'll make sure we get a little annotation somewhere here on the screen for you that'll link you directly to that. So if you haven't read it, go take a look at that. Quickly, some business before we get into the video here, our conversation. If you like our videos, please consider supporting us for free by sharing the video, hitting the like button, and all that sort of stuff. It's easy, free, and helps support the museum. If you want to take your support one more step further, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, supporting programming like this for as little as $25 a year. That's less than your monthly Netflix payment. So we'd really love it if you all are able to do that to help us out if you like our videos. So with all that said, go ahead and jump into our conversation, Lauren. I wonder if maybe you would get us started. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to the subject of birth control, medical history, and all that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. This is the museum is such a great resource. So thanks for having me. So I'm Dr. Lauren MacGyver Thompson. I'm an assistant professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University. And I'm also a faculty research fellow at the Georgia State University College of Law Center for Law, Health, and Society. A bit of a mouthful there.
Yeah, man, heck of a business card.
Yes. And essentially, the way that I came to really be interested in learning more about birth control in the 19th and early 20th centuries was, just from our sort of general political conversations that we're having, today. When I started graduate school, those were just as hot topics as they are now. And I was really interested in the history of women and gender in the United States. And I actually began the journey into kind of finding all those connections I was really interested in the ways that doctors and medicine had sort of thought about women and women's bodies in the 19th century and the way that they connected women's reproductive systems with their mental fitness and their fitness for citizenship, and gave physicians and men in general a sort of scientific angle to deny women full personhood and the vote and all the other sort of rights that we take for granted today. And that looking at those connections, of course, then led me to look at how women had responded to those charges. And many of the people that I was looking at were just insistent that physicians were wrong about this, and that one of the core values at the center of the women's movement had to be the right to one's own body, the right to become pregnant or not when you chose, this idea of voluntary motherhood, which I can say more about, And that was where it started. And so now the book that I'll be publishing, hopefully in 2023, it's coming, is going to be about Mary Ware Dennett, who was a suffragist, and Margaret Sanger, who you may know as one of the quote unquote founders of Planned Parenthood. She was the sort of um, the most central reformer that we know about in the birth control movement. She and Dennett had a rivalry and both sought to control the birth control movement, but in many ways, they were the inheritors of those arguments by the time they started working to really legalize birth control by about 1915, 1920. And so they were bringing all of those same arguments that women who had been their predecessors, in the 19th century, they were bringing all of those to bear in their fight to legalize birth control. It's a very complex story, very complicated story, but that's really where my intellectual interests lie. And it brings together all the things I'm interested in: public health, medicine, law, histories of women and gender. So it's fun to write about for sure.
Yeah, that's always the tricky thing for a historian, to be able to find that sweet spot where all of your
Yep.
interests all come together, because
Yeah.
we all
Yep.
have a few. So
Yep.
well, I'm glad that you're able to find that spot, and it's a great point that I want to underscore there. You mentioning how when this debate really starts to fire up in the public eye in the early 20th century, how in many ways it wasn't new, and it's
That's right.
so often we these kind of things that become big touch points in society. Rarely is it the first time they've ever come up before.
Right.
There's often historical roots to a lot of this, and we're going to touch on a lot of
Absolutely.
that today.
Yes.
So obviously, when talking about birth control, that has a lot to do with mothers and motherhood. And so I wonder if maybe you could get us started by talking about the role and importance of mothers in the 19th century.
Yeah. So I don't think we can overestimate or talk too much about just how important motherhood was as a concept in the 19th century. I mean, it had always been important in the long history of understanding the place of women in the United States and in the colonial period. But in the 19th century, it really takes on new resonance. We're coming out of this period, around the Revolutionary era, the early Republic, where there was this focus on Republican motherhood, and the understanding was that women women's roles in politics really centered on the idea of raising children, especially sons, who would grow up to be political citizens. And so there is this sort of understanding that mothers in that period did need to know how to read and write and be politically educated in order that they pass on that knowledge to their children, so that they could grow up to be citizens participating in a democratic government. By the time we get to the 19th century and really around the Civil War period, the idea of motherhood it still remains political. It still remains centered on the idea that women are raising children to be fit citizens for the Republic, but there's this sort of increased emphasis on the idea that women are the keepers of morality of society. They are more pious than men. Their domain is in the household, and that is where they can exercise their sphere of influence. And it becomes a really central way to divide men and women. Um, we go from the 18th century, where gender is a little bit more fluid. There's a hierarchy. Women are understood to be lesser than men. But by the 19th century, we have the idea of separate spheres and the idea of true womanhood and true manhood. And at the core of true womanhood is this idea that women's pious, religious, moral nature will be that's the key to saving society. And so there's no higher calling in a woman's life than to be a mother. So as you might imagine, that's a very restrictive box to be put in. And if you fell short in some way, if you couldn't have children, if you did for some reason didn't want children, if you weren't married, so on and so forth, it became a way to really restrict women's freedoms and sort of understanding of where they fit into society. So it's a really quite a narrow box, but nonetheless, it's what shaped gender politics in the 19th century.
So, with that in mind, you can see how the stage is going to get set for, birth control to be fairly contentious in the
Yes,
19th century.
right.
So, you know, obviously, people do or don't want kids, for any number of reasons, and in their heart of hearts, even though this is the cultural milieu that they're kind of operating in, you know,
Hmm.
any individual person is going to, have these thoughts and opinions about whether they do or don't want kids.
Right.
So, presuming for a moment that you're a woman in the 19th century who doesn't want kids, if someone were to consult a 19th century doctor about forms of birth control, what might be recommended? Or was it, were they even going to doctors to consult about this sort of thing? Was it just too taboo?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because I think the answer is yes to all of that. First of all, I think we can say that there were, of course, women who probably consulted their local physician about birth control methods, and we're talking about barrier methods in this period. We're not obviously talking about the pill or any kind of like chemical or hormonal method. And we're not really even talking about sterilization yet. Those surgeries are starting to be developed right around the Civil War period, but we're really talking um, about herbs and spermicides and things like that would have prevented pregnancy. And you could ask your local physician, but whether or not you were going to get a straight answer just depended on the physician that you were asking. And so really, I think that the big takeaway from that is that throughout most of American history, right up through about the middle of the 20th century, most women who wanted to use birth control in some form or fashion were really passing down that knowledge within families, within community networks of women. And it was kind of this, it was just something that you talked about with your friends or with your female family members, and everybody kind of knew what things you could take or what things you could use to prevent pregnancy. It was this kind of like folk knowledge that was passed down. And there are books that circulate in the early 19th century that are written by physicians or people interested in health reform that also advise women on how to prevent pregnancy. And we know that we have letters from women living in the revolutionary period who were talking about how they were desperate to plan the size of their families because they were sick of having 8, 9, 10 children in a row. And they usually tried to space their children around breastfeeding, and that sometimes extended breastfeeding would help women plan their families a little bit, but of course that's not completely reliable. And so women were always searching for more ways to control their fertility. And we know that it was working because if you look at the population graphs between the 18th century and the 19th century, the size of the family drops. You go from having large families to, by the end of the 19th century, I think the average number of children really drops to like maybe 2 or 3 a family, which was a huge shift. And so when women were talking to each other about birth control, they're trying to understand what are the kinds of things that I can use, and I can talk a little bit more about that now if that works. But basically, we're really looking at tinctures, herbal concoctions that you would use in douching. You would sometimes drink these teas. They were put into patent medicines that were very, very popular. For example, Lydia Pinkham, who was one of like the first like great American businesswomen, operating in the 19th century, she sold this thing she advertises like vegetable tonic, like it was supposed to basically like any problem that you had, it would fix, whether that was reproductive problems or not, headaches, sore back, like you name it, like take Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. But she also sold things that medicines that she explicitly advertised as, if you have a uterine blockage, take this pill. And it's mother's friend. It's they would use coded language to advertise and to sell these things on the market, and they were just available from your corner drugstore. They were available on the street. They were available via mail order catalog. Reproductive control items were everywhere. And they continue to be everywhere even after laws were passed to try to restrict their sale and their advertising. And I think that's like a big takeaway from the 19th century. Right around the Civil War period, we have this flurry of laws that get passed in every state that are restricting abortion. They're restricting the making and the sale of abortifacients or birth control items. And yet the way that they get around those laws is they start advertising them as health aids. And it wasn't that implausible because, of course, medicine wasn't then what it is today. And the life expectancy was lower, and women did often suffer from reproductive problems that plagued them their whole adult lives that there were no cures for. If you had, for example, something fairly simple that would get solved today very easily, like a vaginal tear during labor, that could be ultimately life-threatening if they couldn't figure out how to fix it, if it got infected, and of course there's no antibiotics. And so something that would not be a big deal today often would, if it didn't outright kill the woman, it would certainly cause them great distress and make them ill. And they might suffer through that for years and years and years. And so the idea that the individual could heal themselves and could control their own bodies, that was a really seductive idea in this period. And in many ways, it explains why physicians, the practice of medicine, was not super respected in this period. I'm sure listeners may know a little bit about this, but doctors weren't there was no formal medical training really until the late 19th century mostly. And even then, even around the turn of the century and right up until about right before, I would say, the Great Depression, that's when doctors kind of take their place in American society as respected experts and so forth, who are practicing science and all of that. But in the 19th century, that is not the case. Ordinary medicine is competing with folk healers. It's competing with midwives. It's who are midwives really are managing most of women's reproductive health in this period. And so doctors do not have the kind of social capital that they're going to have by the 20th century. And so patent medicine is this very popular way for a person to control their own health. And of course, that would extend to abortifacients and to contraceptive devices and mechanisms. So,
yeah, a lot to go off of there.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Well, it's all good stuff there. I think it's fascinating that it's almost like sort of a secret society, made up of women and close personal friends, and you almost kind of have to know to ask about it. People aren't going to volunteer this information.
Right.
You have to know who to ask and when. It's fascinating, and combined with that whole idea of coded language that people are using for advertisements, it's really, I think, kind of an interesting world that these women have to navigate here.
Yes. Yeah. It's this weird combination of it's everywhere, but also it's still not, it's not out in the open like it is today. And they're not talking about sex openly in the way that we do today. So it's ubiquitous. People know where to go if they need to access it, but at the same time, it's still under the surface. And I think that creates a very strange environment for men and women who are trying to seek to understand how do you prevent pregnancy, and if you do get pregnant, and you don't want to be, what is to be done about it, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And something that we should probably just touch on a little bit here is you talked about having large families, 7, 8 plus children. In the pre-germ theory world, that the Civil War sits pretty firmly in, right at the
Mhm.
tail end of that,
Right.
unfortunately for those those that fought and
Yeah.
served.
Yep.
Um, but in the pre-germ theory world, the act of childbirth was a bit dangerous. So there's,
Yes.
we've touched on these kind of the idea that this is, of health benefits to women, but in some ways it could be life saving, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think many women were absolutely terrified of the prospect of childbirth. The entire mechanism and environment around marriage and women's lives, being so circumscribed as wives and mothers, what in many ways was terrifying for young women. If you might go into a marriage and you knew nothing about sex because it was not considered polite to discuss, and all of that is under the surface. And then you might know nothing about sex. Your husband in this period that women have no rights. It's not just the vote that they don't have. They have no, there's no custody rights. That if you choose to seek a divorce, you lose custody of your children. You're not able to keep your own earnings. You can't serve on juries. You pay taxes, but you have all these sort of like obligations of citizenship, but none of like the concrete rights. And I think that women who were confronting that knew from the very beginning that they had to figure out a way to make sure that their lives within marriage would not be miserable and ultimately kill them, by a childbirth or maybe through an abusive husband or something like that. And so, yeah, like I think women in this period were doing, even if they weren't using outright contraceptive methods like douching or seeking out patent medicines, or sanitative washes or feminine hygiene products and things like that, they would at the very least, and I mentioned this before, try to like track their periods. We have women's diaries from this period where we can tell, they're putting little X's and they're trying to figure out when is it safe, for sexual intercourse, and when is it kind of the dangerous time, and when is it the safe period, and all of those things. And so, was it reliable? No. But it had some effect because like we said, the population, the number of children that families have does end up dropping by the end of the century, but in pretty significantly. So we know that people were using all these different methods, even if it wasn't overtly talked about.
Obviously, the story of, birth control and how that evolves over time is very much a woman-led story, no question about it. But I'm curious if maybe you could just speak a little bit to the role of men in terms of advocates for
Yeah.
this, because I'm sure there were some. I mean, it's I would presume, an unpopular opinion and taboo in some of the ways that we've been discussing. But were there
Mhm.
any sort of, male allies in this time period?
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny. You might think, well, you don't find those until like maybe the 1920s or 1930s, as some doctors kind of like get on board with legalizing birth control. But actually, there were a number of men in the 19th century, many of whom I think were definitely on the more like radical political side of things. Like we're talking men who were socialists, who were utopianists, who uh, understood and viewed marriage, for women as kind of in many ways a trap, a prison. There was in particular this man named Moses Harmon, who in the 1860s and 70s, I'm sorry, those are all my notifications. He founds a newspaper called Lucifer the Light Bearer. This is just after the Civil War, but what a name for a paper, right? But his goal was to bring knowledge, to shine a light on all these social issues that we don't talk about. And one of his big crusades is, he defined marriage as legal rape. I mean, this is a very radical idea, and yet there were many people who also understood it as that, because as we said, women have no rights, at all. Married women were under the doctrine of coverture. There are property laws that get passed, particularly before the Civil War, that try to make commerce and capitalism a little bit easier, and they allow women to inherit property, whereas before they couldn't. But that doesn't really change the idea that women's legal identity, once you get married, is folded into that of your husband. And so people like Moses Harman, socialists, radicals, looked at that system of marriage and were just, appalled. And they begin to advocate that women must have freedom in marriage. You must be free to not only marry who you want, but get divorced if you want to. That if and they advocate this idea that people who want to be married and are entering into this mutual contract, equally, that's going to produce healthier and better children. Moses Harman goes on to found or to rename his Lucifer the Light Bearer newspaper into something like the American Eugenics Journal, as eugenics kind of becomes a popular theory after the Civil War. And he's advocating for positive eugenics. In other words, if the right people love each other and get married, they'll have healthy children. And who doesn't want healthy babies? Like, he's not steering toward that negative eugenic aspect quite yet. But yeah, I mean, he was one of the people that would have the daring and the bravery to publish columns in his newspaper that outright advocated for legal birth control. And he was shut down many, many times by the censors, and he was sent to jail. I mean, this had serious consequences. I can talk a little bit about the 1873 Comstock Law, but I think he was put in a work camp. I mean, this is as a punishment. I mean, this was serious. And so, but he is one of the men who's talking about this, and there are others along the way. By the time we get to the early 20th century, many men who were kind of like politically on the left, were openly supportive of birth control. And for example, Margaret Sanger's first husband was, arrested for handing out her first birth control newspaper on the streets of New York. I mean, so there were people who were certainly aware of the social and cultural and gender issues that surrounded the illegality of birth control and abortion, for sure.
What an interesting sounding guy, for sure.
Yeah, Moses Harman. Look him up. He is very interesting.
Yeah, love that. One, before we move on to the next question, one distinction I want to make with something you mentioned earlier about how the developing professionalization of the medical profession that
Mhm.
starts to happen. Kind of, there's a big sort of revolution around the time of the Civil War, which is why I want to bring
Yeah,
it up, because we talk about it a lot, where
right.
America, doctors in the United States start to become producers of medical knowledge rather than consumers, which is
Yes.
applicable for all kinds of things that we talk about here quite often, surgeries and specializations like
Yes.
the field of cardiology and whatnot.
Right.
But one thing that they're not focusing as much on, and we become producers of medical knowledge because there's just a lot of cases that happen because a lot of people get hurt during the Civil War. But
Mhm.
one way where we don't see that kind of quantum-esque leap forward is in the field of women's health, because
Yeah.
while there are women soldiers, as one of my colleagues, Tracy McIntyre, has spoken about here on this channel, there are women soldiers. They are, we're talking hundreds as opposed to hundreds of thousands. So
Yeah.
there is sort of a leap forward in terms of medical knowledge in the United States, but the people that don't see the benefits of that as much are women, which is what you were speaking to earlier. Just wanted
Yeah,
to make that
yeah,
distinction.
that's such an interesting point when you think about the history of medicine and the history of medical education in the United States, because I mentioned that in the antebellum period, that's when we begin to see the first flurry of state and local laws that start getting passed to restrict abortion and sales and use of contraceptives. And actually that the passage of those laws was initiated and supported by doctors who had newly formed the American Medical Association, I believe in 1848. And they're the organization, kind of central professional organization that is going to continue to lobby throughout the 19th century to take over women's health. I mean, this was a gradual process. Like I said, like throughout most of the 19th century, most people are having children at home. It continues to be midwives that largely help deliver babies. But by the time we get to the Great Depression, for example, the vast majority of women are going to the hospital to have a baby, and physicians are the ones facilitating that. The specialty of obstetrics and gynecology in the early part of the 19th century is like, that's the specialty you did if like if you did go to medical school, they felt like you weren't smart enough to to do the other specialties. It was not respected. But by the end of the 19th century, it becomes essentially one of the most respected specialties in medicine. And that, there's a very complex history there, which other folks like, Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens have written about. The birth of American gynecology is rooted in physicians experimenting on enslaved women to figure out surgical techniques that would go on to save millions of women's lives, in the future. But the origins of American gynecology and obstetrics are really rooted in racism and misogyny. And that misogyny and that racism, it shaped the discipline. It influenced how doctors saw women as patients. This is again, I think we mentioned this in the beginning, the origin of physicians, kind of understanding women as not fit for citizenship because of their reproductive organs. And so as they gain more and more medical knowledge, and it becomes a specialty that becomes acceptable, not just acceptable, but like revered in American medicine, it's one of those things where, the consequences for women are, yes, childbirth eventually starts to become safer as they develop things like cesarean section and so on and so forth. Yet it's rooted in this understanding that women, are essentially slaves to their reproductive system, and they're not able to make independent decisions, and they need physicians to make those decisions for them, whether it's, centered on pregnancy and childbirth, or whether it's centered on much bigger things like voting. So it really kind of shapes how womanhood and how the women's movement develops over the course of the 19th century as they respond to doctors, scientists, and government officials kind of all taking this like particular stance on how women's bodies operate in concert with their minds. And it's to speak to, just on a personal level, just how respected the field of OBGYN becomes. I'm actually the child of 4 generations of OBGYNs who were all practicing in a small town in Ohio, and it was passed down from father to son until my dad. And so it really has this like very complex and long history, and it's deeply, deeply intertwined with, unfortunately, racism and misogyny.
That's quite a family lineage there, and
Yeah.
probably has given you some interesting food for thought when it comes to
Yes.
some of your research projects.
Yes, exactly. I have a lot of old medical textbooks from my great grandfather somewhere on my shelf back here.
I bet so.
Yep.
My next question is a bit of a selfish one. I want to talk a little bit about condoms in the 19th century, and I want to ask this specifically because we have a Civil War era condom in our collection.
Ooh,
and
that's
I want to
cool.
give folks a sense of how common or not that was.
Yeah, so another great question, because condoms are definitely one of those things that obviously have been around as long as people have been able to figure out how to use them. We know we have them from ancient archaeological sites, and we know the Greeks and the Romans used them, and the Egyptians, and they've just been around, for as long as people have tried to control their fertility. In the context of the American Civil War and the middle of the 19th century, we're actually seeing kind of a revolution in condom making and condom wearing, because this is the period when there are all these different developments in the rubber industry. And so rather than having to rely like on animal skins to make condoms, they can now make them out of rubber. As rubber undergoes this transformation revolution and how it's made, there are different processes, vulcanization and so forth, that they develop to make rubber very flexible. You can make it very thin so that it doesn't degrade in heat or in cold. And so condoms, like other reproductive items of control, in the United States, were available anywhere you looked. You could order them, you could buy them in the corner store. However, they do have a stigma. They're really associated mostly with prostitution. Prostitutes obviously had a very vested interest in preventing pregnancy. They used condoms with male clientele, and as a result, there are women, we know that women kind of reject the condom who are in marriages because it is associated with prostitutes. And so that kind of narrow, the condom is, even then it was, relatively effective. I can't speak to, the percentage of effectiveness of 19th century condoms versus today's condoms. But, they I think mostly kind of got the job done, but a lot of married women didn't want to use them because of that association with prostitution and venereal disease too. Of course, men who visited prostitutes and prostitutes themselves who wanted to avoid venereal disease, they were interested in using condoms because it did, again, provide some protection. What degree of protection, debatable, not really sure about that, but it was one of those things that, I think some couples did absolutely use them. They probably just kind of were like, oh, we're not going to think about the fact that this is associated with prostitutes. They just kind of overlooked that. But then other women were very sort of, resistant to using them because they did not want their husbands to think of them that way, or they didn't want their husbands to be like, oh, wow, I can use this. And if I go cheat on my wife with a prostitute, she'll never know because I'm not going to get venereal disease, So yeah, condoms, definitely very prevalent, very much part of the reproductive control universe, but certainly contested, and certainly probably not as widely used as today, for sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction there. And in case anyone was wondering, the condom in our collection, I believe, is sheep intestine lining
Yes.
or based or something like that.
Yep. Makes
Um,
sense.
and it's also interesting too, talking how condoms are associated with prostitution. How during the Civil War as well, there's calling it a revolution is maybe putting it a bit strongly, but at least in one city in Nashville, they're taking some interesting precautions. Their union surgeons in the city examine prostitutes in the city and give them sort of a certificate, kind of like a clean bill of health,
Yeah.
like they don't have
Right.
any venereal diseases, and here's your little kind of license or card that proves that. So there's
Mhm.
some degree, or at least some efforts in Nashville specifically. I don't know if we have
Mhm.
records of that happening elsewhere, but
Mhm.
some early attempts to try and,
Yeah.
again, standardize is maybe a strong word, but
Right.
do
Early
something
attempts
there.
at public sexual health.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
I just think kind of an interesting little thing, and always like bringing it up whenever I can, and it's
Yeah, that is
relevant now.
fascinating. I did not know that about Nashville during the Civil War. Wow.
Yeah, we have one of the cards, and in fact, we'll insert it
Amazing.
right here, right now. And when this video goes up, you can look at
Wow.
it. So we've talked a little bit about this, about some of the penalties for buying,
Oh, yeah.
selling, using birth control, actual laws. You could go to
Right.
jail. Talk a bit about some of the laws and some of the consequences.
Yeah. So, like we said before, in the sort of antebellum period, we begin to see the I would say actually like the late 1830s, we begin to see some of the first states pass um, laws that center around the advertising and sale of contraceptive devices and abortive fashions. But really, they're trying to regulate the advertising of these things because this is an unregulated industry. Anybody can put anything in a patent medicine and call it, mother's friend or feminine hygiene wash, or, use this for, for, your vaginal health or whatever. They can frame it however they want, and it might have something really harmful in it. And that, was not totally uncommon. And so legislatures start to get interested in regulating those things, but it's related also to kind of like regulating the patent medicine industry in general, which is totally unregulated, and people are buying things for headaches that end up making them really sick or killing them. So that's like the origin of the first laws, like passed in the middle of the 1830s, late 1830s. By the time we get to the 1840s and 1850s, we begin to see the physicians and the American Medical Association kind of go on this concerted crusade to outlaw abortion and contraception on the state level, because they do this from, they want to restrict midwives and their power. This is part of that, trying to professionalize in general, trying to wrest the discipline of medicine away from people who aren't educated in medical schools. And it's the beginnings of obstetrics and gynecology, trying to make that a male dominated field. So we begin to see those laws get passed 1850s, 1860s, right around the Civil War. It's not until 1873, though, that we really have on the federal level a law that is rooted in ideas of morality. And this is what was called the Comstock Law. It passed in 1873. Anthony Comstock had been a Union soldier. He was born in Connecticut. He went to battle, and it was, he was stationed with his battalion or whatever, and he was just like completely appalled by his fellow soldiers' copious use of pornography and drinking. And he had been raised in kind of a very conservative, strict household. His mother had died when he was a young boy, so he had this, and I think he grew up with this like very restrictive idea of like how mothers should operate. I believe she died in childbirth or right afterwards. So his early years were kind of shaped by this idea that like, well, a mother is a martyr, and if you die in childbirth, like so be it, you're sacrificing yourself for the ultimate good. So after the Civil War, he moves to New York, and he gets involved with folks who are running the Young Men's Christian Association there, YMCA. And they're obviously, focused on Christian values and trying to help young men who move to the city not get, involved in the drugs and the prostitution that are like rampant in New York. I mean, sex was everywhere. You had sex shops, you had, on every corner you had prostitutes. I mean, it was New York, late 19th century New York is a really interesting place. And so Comstock arrives, he gets in cahoots with the local YMCA folks. They start to get backing from some of the most elite people in the city who have a lot of money, and they start financing the YMCA and Comstock, and they start doing these raids on local businesses that are selling, sexual material. And he goes and knocks on the door of people who are providing abortions, people like Madame Restell, who was a notorious abortionist in New York City, who had been operating since before the Civil War. She was in the business of providing abortion for something like 30 or 40 years. And he personally arrests her. He's personally responsible for confiscating like millions of advertising pamphlets, pornography, contraceptive devices, douching, mechanisms, patent medicines that he says these are abortifacient. I mean, everything. He amasses this like enormous collection, and then he takes it to Congress, and he sets up this exhibition for congressmen to come and look at how immoral America is, and we must stop pornography, we must stop sex and the trade of sex and prostitution and women seeking abortions and all these things. And within like less than a month, I mean, it might have been even something like 2 weeks, Comstock gets Congress to pass a federal law. And it is centered, it's going to be run through the Postal Service. And he is appointed the head of that agency, and he is able to send out postal inspectors. And their job now is to censor the mail, and anything that gets sent through the mail, which would have been like everything in this period, there's no email, they were able to confiscate those things. And the Comstock Law was very widely framed. It said anything that was obscene, lewd, or lascivious. And that could mean anything. They could say anything was obscene, lewd, or lascivious. And so they just go on this kind of rampage over, the next, 60 years, trying to control what gets sent through the mails. And Comstock really is personally responsible for people committing suicide because they get arrested so many times. He is responsible for driving an already like underground practice and understandings of sex, like even further underground, making it more taboo. However, it does not necessarily decrease the amount of information, pamphlets, sex advertising, pornography, so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily decrease it. It just makes the penalties for manufacturing it or making it much higher. And these were serious consequences. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars in fines, long jail terms. One particular woman who I looked at when I was doing my dissertation work, her name was Ida Craddock, and she wrote sex manuals. And people would write and thank her and be like, oh my gosh, I didn't thank you so much. I didn't know how any of this worked. And now, I can be a better husband or a better wife, and, so on and so forth. And he arrested her something like 2 or 3 times. She was put in Rikers Island, which is not a place that you want to be in the 1870s, 80s. And she ends up committing suicide rather than be arrested again. She gets wind that he's going to arrest her again. And she just is like, no, I'm just going to take myself out of the equation. I mean, so this was, I don't think we can overestimate just how much the Comstock laws would shape that post-Civil War Reconstruction, early 20th century era in terms of the distribution of birth control information, abortion information and provision, and then obviously prostitution and pornography as well.
Yeah, our viewers were introduced to Anthony Comstock. We had a month or 2 ago, we had Dr. Judy Giesberg on talking about her book, Sex in the Civil War.
Yes, great book. Yep.
Absolutely. And obviously Comstock came up in that conversation, but this is great looking at it through a slightly different lens. We were obviously talking about pornography primarily in that discussion, but yeah, that's wild.
It is wild. He was a person right up until his death, like literally the week before he died. He was testifying in an obscenity trial for Margaret Sanger's husband, who had been arrested for distributing birth control pamphlets on the street that Sanger had written. And there was a lot of what's the term, schadenfreude from the kind of birth control, free, sexual freedom type supporters. When he died 1 week after testifying, they were like, serves you right, So he was not. There were many Americans who thought, he was awful. He was, having negative consequences on many Americans' lives. Just this one man was very, very powerful. He was one of the people that arrested, for example, Moses Harman for his Lucifer the Light Bearer newspaper. So yeah, all kinds of things would get deemed obscene. And there, as the American court system kind of expanded and refined the definition of obscenity, it was very easy to be prosecuted under this federal law, and it was a federal crime, and that was serious. So,
absolutely, yeah. One of my favorite, kind of cartoons that was in Judy's book was mocking Comstock. He's dragging some woman and says, "This woman gave birth to a naked child," and just that was some sort of affront. He's dragging her into a court of law or something. But
there's another one that I always like to show students, which is, it's like this artist who's trying to paint a woman, and she's in a lake, and all you can see is her head, and Comstock is standing there going, well, everyone knows she's nude under the water. And so don't, and so just this the way he conceptualized sex and from a very misogynistic place. I mean, he really had no sympathy for women who were afraid of dying in childbirth and so forth. He's like, well, if my mother can do it, you can do it too. I mean, that was kind of his attitude. And he had a profound effect on the American legal landscape in terms of obscenity. And then there's going to be a complete sea change by the time we get to the 20s and 30s as people start to really push back on the Comstock laws and advocate for freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
As we kind of come to a close in our discussion, I mean, one of the things that we try and do as often as we can here at the museum is try and connect the past to the present. And in
Yeah.
light of this whole conversation, obviously the Civil War, 19th century was a while ago. What parallels or connections might we draw from this discussion,
Right.
from then to now?
Yeah. So in many ways, obviously, we're dealing with a totally different landscape. I mean, I think today, the American medical profession, professional societies for obstetrics and gynecology are very, very focused on racial justice. They're focused on reproductive justice. They support birth control and abortion rights. But at the same time, we still have, very similarly to the 19th century, we have many, many people in this country who are whose anti-abortion and anti-birth control views are firmly, firmly rooted in Christian morality. And so that's something that's like a continuity across the centuries, across the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And that continuity matters because we are seeing a huge increase in these state laws that seek to completely outlaw abortion once again, the same way that it would have been in the 19th century. We're also seeing we're beginning to see steps toward outlawing in some ways birth control. Certainly one of the things that kind of conservative anti-abortion and anti-birth control advocates have sought to do recently is restrict the mailing of abortifacient pills through the mail. There are safe medications that are, the FDA has approved, like misoprostol and mifepristone, and they have approved those medications for home use by women who are in their first trimester and can take these medications safely, basically induce miscarriage or abortion at home. The FDA has said these are safe and you are able to do this. And they are seeking to ban the mailing of those medications through the mail, which echoes this long history of the Comstock laws. And you have to remember the Comstock law was really not overturned until 1965, when the Supreme Court ruled that birth control for married couples was a matter of privacy and, it should be up to their discretion. And that the law that was at the center of that case was one of those local, I forgot to mention, once Comstock passes that federal law, a flurry of state mini Comstock laws follow. And so that particular case dealt with the law that was in Connecticut that modeled itself after the Comstock law. I think we're seeing a resurgence in the attempt to control access to abortion, access to contraception. And at the same time, I think history tells us that no matter what laws are passed, people will still seek to control their fertility. It may end up looking a little bit differently than it did in the 19th century. And yet everywhere American people who are pregnant or don't want to be or want to become pregnant or whatever, they're going to do what they're going to do despite what the law says. And we already are seeing that happen, for example, in Texas, where they've essentially outlawed abortion. We've seen a huge migration of people who are traveling to nearby states to obtain abortions in other places where it's still legal. So I think that the past can inform much of our understanding of the landscape of reproductive justice. And it also offers us lessons in what not to do. So, with that, I think viewers who are watching this, can kind of remember this like long history and kind of be able to put what's happening today into bigger context for sure.
Absolutely. That there's a lot to be said about learning from the past. As one of the things we like to say here, there's hope in history if you learn from it, and that's the the critical aspect, that if you need to learn from it first.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that we try and do here. Well, Lauren, this was fantastic. Thank you so
Thank you so
much
much.
for
Thank you for
for
having me.
yeah, we're thrilled you could join us. Thank all of you out there for tuning in. Thrilled that you tuned in for this episode. If you enjoyed it, consider hitting the like button, sharing the video, telling your friends about it. It's a great, easy, simple, free way that anyone can do to support us. If you want to take that support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine to support video programming like this. And with that said, this is John and Lauren signing off.
Thank you.